So I'm going to talk about the menstrual cycle, and I'll be highlighting the function of the 4 hormones that you need to know, and as they relate to the menstrual cycle. All right. But the first thing is, so the menstrual cycle, it's a cycle. So I'm going to draw a big circle here. Oops. And a typical cycle is about 28 days. So this would be day 1, and this would be day 28 here. Okay. And so across the circle here at day 14, this is when ovulation typically occurs. So that's the egg release. All right. And day 1 is actually when menses starts. So when women start to bleed, that's how we count day 1. So menstruation starts. And that lasts for anywhere between 5 to 8 days. All right. It's going to go from day 1. That's when we start counting it, is when the woman starts bleeding, and then she anywhere between 5 to 8 days, and it stops. Oops, 8 should probably be further down. Sorry, guys. There we go. Day 8. Okay. Day 14 is ovulation. All right. And so the idea is that women are often fertile anytime between kind of day 11 to say 16 or 17. Okay. Is the egg can be fertilized. And the idea is that it can be fertilized even before it's released, because sperm can survive for up to, I'd say, about 2 days in the oviduct, all right, in the uterus or the oviduct. And so the idea is that if the sperm reaches the oviduct before the egg, it can hang out there for maybe a day or so until, if in case an egg appears. So this is when a woman could technically get pregnant, right? And so the idea is that the hormones that come into play during this, there's 4 of them, and all of them are about either releasing the egg or preparing the uterus for this egg, that the possibly fertilized egg, the possible embryo that could implant and then lead to pregnancy. All right. And so the idea is in the first part of the cycle here, okay, the idea is that they're preparing for this ovulation. And so the hormone that is necessary to mature the egg is called FSH. And FSH is released by the pituitary, and it acts on the ovary. All right, and what it does is it helps mature the egg. All right, so it makes that egg kind of ready to be released. Then at day 14, you're going to get a spike in LH, and LH causes the actual egg release. It's also released by the pituitary, by the way, and it causes egg release. So that's what's going on here, all right? And so the idea is that LH causes the egg release, and so that's on day 14. And so this is going to have a big peak at ovulation. I'll show you what this looks like in a graph later, okay? But you get a big peak of LH here at day 14, and FSH tends to be high in the days before as the egg gets matured and is released. Matures and prepares for release. All right. So that's what's going on in the ovary, right? These are both released by the pituitary and act in the ovary. And then there's 2 hormones that act outside of the ovary, and they are produced by the ovary, but they act on the uterus. All right. And so in the first half of the cycle, you have estrogen. Oops, sorry, American spelling. Okay, estrogen, or why is this not focusing? Or estrogen if you are British. But anyway, and so estrogen builds up. You can't really see that. The uterine lining. Okay, so it makes it nice and soft and cushy. Really what it's doing is adding a bunch of blood vessels and things. It's vascularizing it. But anyway, it builds up the uterine lining so that it's nice and thick. And if this egg that's released on day 14 gets fertilized, then the thickness will be there and the egg can implant and successfully go on to create a placenta. Okay. And so the estrogen is causing the building up of the uterine lining, so it's going to be high during the first half of the cycle. The second half of the cycle, you're going to get progesterone, and progesterone is also produced by the ovary, but it acts on the uterus, and the progesterone maintains the uterine lining. So it keeps it thick in case there is an embryo that implants. So it's already been built up, okay? And progesterone is maintaining it. But the idea is that progesterone remains high, so it starts about day 14 and it remains high for maybe the next, I don't know, 8 to 10 days, but then eventually it stops being produced, and so the uterine lining is no longer going to be maintained, and it's going to start to be shed. And when it's shed, that is what menstruation is. It's the shedding of the uterine lining. So that's your cycle, is that you have estrogen high in the first half, you have FSH, which is usually high here, sometime here, all right? LH, there's always a huge peak of it here at ovulation, and then you get progesterone that's high in the second half. So what does that look like on a graph? So the exact way it looks on a graph is always going to be slightly different. I've seen about 4 or 5 different versions of this on various iGCSEs, but the trends will always be the same, okay? And so you will have one hormone that is either kind of high at day 1, it may show be a little high, but it will be high for the first half, and then it will start to dip. Yes, I'll get her in a second. And then it will start to dip here in the second half, all right? It may never get really, really low. This is going to be your estrogen because it is high as it before the ovulation, all right? Then you're also going to always have one in which you get a huge peak of it right at day 14. Probably won't be, right? This is LH, the one that is actually causing the release of the egg because it peaks on day 14 when the egg is actually released. All right, so that's your LH. And then you're going to have one that is going to be low at the beginning, and then in the second half after ovulation, it's going to come up and then drop off. That is your progesterone. All right, so these are general trends. It's not going to look exactly like this, but that's the general idea. And then you're going to have another one that sits somewhere else. And I've seen this. This is the one that seems to vary the most, and it doesn't seem to be any. I've seen it represented a few different ways, but often it has a little peak. Oops. Oh, great. So it has a little peak here just before the LH perhaps, and then goes back down. And this is your FSH. All right, sometimes this peak is more aligned with the LH, but it's going to be a smaller peak. It's not going to be high for the same amount of time that estrogen and progesterone are. So that's what this is going to look like visually. And they could have, remember that progesterone and estrogen are both produced in the pituitary. Okay, and FSH and LH are both produced in the ovary. And so that means that perhaps they could have a graph that only shows what happens in the ovary. They could have one that only shows what's in the pituitary. As long as you know what the general trend should be and where these are produced and what they do, then you should be all set with it.